Christopher Forsbäck is Swedish and was wounded in the line of duty serving with the armed forces of Ukraine. We're going to talk about his experience in supporting the war effort in Ukraine. We're going to talk about training Ukrainian soldiers, and we're going to talk about demining, amongst other topics. I've been looking forward to this a long time. Christopher, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Well, let's start with your personal incentives for serving in Ukraine. What were your motivations, and really how and when did you get started?
Well, I landed in Poland the 18th of March last year. So it was quite soon after the conflict started. But basically, I'm ex-army, ex-Swedish army. Been serving for over 20 years in the Swedish Armed Forces combined. And what I saw was basically a repeat of the 30s. So, yeah, I figured after 3 or 4 days, when you could see the Ukrainians actually holding the Russians off, because me, as everybody else, thought this was going to be a 3-day thing and then this wasn't going to be done. But when they were holding the Russians off, and when their president went out and asked for foreign help, I actually realized that I can do this. I can go down and help them. So my first incentive was to go down and fight. But when we landed, I brought around 8 Swedish soldiers with me down, or 7 Swedish and a Norwegian. The rocket attack on Javovir has just occurred, so the Foreign Legion was basically shut down for a while. So we sat in Poland for a couple of days, trying to figure out what to do, and didn't really get any good options. So we decided to basically go to Lviv to see if we could find something. We got a contact in Lviv, a businessman actually, who offered to help us get in contact with Ukrainian units and help us the best he could to actually help Ukraine. The fun thing about this guy, he's an ex-CEO for a really big European brewery. He is the ex-CEO of one of the biggest cell phone companies in Ukraine. And he's a Russian.
I think I may know who you mean there, but yes, that's interesting.
I'm not going to name him, but so he put us in contact with actually Pravi sector, which is one of the infamous Nazi organizations in Ukraine. And in this Nazi organization, the first guy I meet is an ex-Israeli paratrooper serving as a platoon commander. So the company that they were setting up then is what we ended up training, because I realized quite soon that, yeah, they have soldiers and there is soldiers coming in. But as a former platoon commander back home, I have been doing a lot of instructing and training. So yeah, that's what I decided to do actually, because yeah, in the fight, I'm only a rifle, but as an instructor, I can actually do some big things, training a lot of soldiers.
That's leveraging your skills, and experience. And this is a bit of a challenge, isn't it? Because when I was in Lviv in August, we went to see Superhumans, the Rehabilitation Center. And of course, a lot of people, even though they have multiple amputations, really want to get back to the front. This is extraordinary atmosphere there. Rather than it being depressing, people are finding purpose and wanting to get back to the fight. But of course, with multiple amputations, that's difficult. Training, however, is an option open to people. But is there a real challenge? Unless you are experienced at training, unless you have actually done that and trained to be trained, as it were, is it quite difficult actually for someone who may have the experience to nonetheless communicate that effectively to other people?
It is. It's extremely hard if you don't have the skill set to actually train another person, and you need to do this. You don't have a lot of time in Ukraine to train the soldiers. You need to make this training interesting and active, so they actually pick up on what you're telling, because you are stuffing them with knowledges. So in the beginning, the first times we did this, they told us that, yeah, you have 10 days. You need to learn the soldiers the basic skills in 10 days. That's impossible. You can't build soldiers. You can build fighters. You can give them fighting skills and hints like that, but you don't get the repetitive training that is required to actually be able to do this on a soldier level. I know the Ukrainians had a really hard time understanding what we told them when we said that you need to train on your own, you need to repeat this and stuff like that. The easiest way that I found in the beginning to actually show them what we were talking about was taking an AK-74, which has never been my service rifle, and show them magazine changes. It's shit boring. It looks really easy. Yeah, you can put that stuff in, but can you do it when you're scared? Can you do it when you're stressed? This is the type of things that you need to make them understand.
Can you do it in the dark? Can you do it in the wet? Can you do it when people are screaming all around you? Yeah.
When it's cold, when it's, yeah. And I think we succeeded fairly well in this, with a range of success depending on the units we train. But the army units, or the units that actually knew they were going to be fighting within days, they were very, very, very interested and very attentive when we teach them. And like Pravi sector, you had guys there that's been fighting since 14. They were the best pupils in every class. They were listening. They had been fighting. They knew they could fight, but they knew they did lack these small things that different a soldier from a fighter.
That's absolutely fascinating, because one of my preconceptions would be that if someone has been fighting for that period of time, maybe not permanently in the trenches, but coming in and out of civilian life, going back, doing service, maybe even on a seasonal basis, they may learn, let's say, bad habits, or they may learn not even a bad habit, but a certain way of doing things. I would have thought they'd be perhaps less receptive to another methodology, but actually say it's the opposite. That's really fascinating.
Yeah, but I thought as you did, but these guys been fighting for so long, so they knew they were lacking in certain important parts. Yeah, they could shoot, they could throw grenade, they could do this and that. They were extremely well trained and physically fit, but they were lacking these small things that actually makes you a soldier, and they really, really wanted that.
And can those small things in certain circumstances make the difference between life and death, between being, badly injured and less badly injured, or making a more effective fight against the enemy? What are the differences that these make?
They'll make you a lot more effective. It will make you more structured as a fighter. You'll do things exactly the same. You'll set up things exactly the same. Stuff like that. It's extremely small things that makes your life a lot easier on the front lines. It will make the interaction in the squads a lot easier. Everybody knows exactly what to do, when to do it, how to do it. So yeah, it makes a difference. It does. It's not going to make a difference if you get wounded, how you get wounded, but it might make a hell of a difference in how you treat a wound, for example. So
And
that's the important thing.
And this sort of consistency then of training, this consistency of methodologies and practice, is it been a challenge? Has it been a challenge rather through the war? Because of course Ukraine's mobilized a lot of people. You have some who've had NATO training, some who've been fighting since 2014, others who come fresh from civilian life. Is it still a challenge to get a degree of consistency of training and method across the entire, what's become a huge military apparatus?
Well, it has and it hasn't. Most Ukrainians, when they come into the training we give them, what I normally do Monday morning, I'll tell them what I'm going to try and give them. I'll tell them what I expect from them. And I'll tell them what I will not accept from them. So, for example, I get an instant respect. They do not mess around on my trainings at all. They do not have these discussion groups that the Ukrainians love to have. And I think that's because they expect a movie picture of me as an instructor, for an instructor. Because if you put me in there, I'm a sergeant, but they won't give me any hassles. They'll listen like preschool kids listening to their teacher. If you put a Ukrainian major in there, you're gonna have chaos, in my opinion. For the Ukrainians, that's normal, but for us as Western instructors, that's chaos.
Yeah, it's like a more Full Metal Jacket than
yeah.
That's fascinating. And how do, I mean, this is going to be one of my questions. You've sort of partially answered it already, which I think is fascinating. And that is, how do Ukrainians respond to, let's say, sort of command structure? How do they respond to, hierarchies and so on? Because unlike Russians, which are famously hierarchical, vertical in their structure, but very little innovation goes from bottom to top. It seems to me that the Ukrainians have the opposite problem. They don't like verticals. They don't like to be told what to do, and they do like to debate and express their opinion and have that, heard above the chain. What's your impressions?
They do. I mean, the Russians are whipped into submission. The Ukrainians are not. They are the opposite. On the other hand, if you make clear for them that we need to do this is for your sake, and I will not accept you fucking this up just because your personal issues, stuff like that. That's another thing we always bring up into the trainings, is this individual thinking that Ukrainians have. And I love them for having it. And it's lovely in a civilian life, but it does not function in an army. And yeah, they'll give me this absolute command right when I train them and stuff like that. It's a bit harder when you get a Ukrainian in there, but normally it takes a couple of days and then they start actually swinging around a bit. But you can't take that out of them. That's a big part of the Ukrainian personality. So you can't get it out completely. On the other hand, I think it's good, because if you look at the Russian army, a sergeant can't get up against an officer and saying you're wrong. You can do that in the Ukrainian army in the same way as we can do it in our armies back here in the West. And that's a strength. If you have an experienced soldier, he will be listened to. I've seen several examples of this, both in training and at the front. So yeah, I think it's, even though it's annoying for us who's used to soldiers actually listening, yeah, they're allowed to have their own opinion, but they do not voice that out loud in training when you're trying to teach them things. It's the way you build a strong army, letting people know that, yeah, your opinion will be heard, it will be listened to. And I think you'll have whip dogs like the Russians. And concerning that, yeah, I actually feel sorry for them, especially at the front, because me as a soldier at the front, if nobody were listening to my experience and my knowledge, I go nuts.
Especially if you see mistakes being
Yeah.
made, especially if you see tactics which are highly profligate. And this is another aspect, isn't it? In that the Russian tactics are by definition rather brutish and basic, because one, you cannot defer down authority down the rank. You cannot give agency to people down the ranks, because that goes against their entire system.
Yeah.
That does mean that you can't do complex operations. Is Ukraine therefore able to perform more effectively? Is it able to innovate right throughout the chain of command rather than having this sort of Russian, rather simplistic, brutish top-down structure?
We had some issues with it this spring when the offensive kicked off, but that was not officers trying to be some sort of small generals. It was basically a lack of knowledge. So yeah, in the planning stages and stuff like that, we tried to give them as much knowledge as possible. But I've seen some examples where I, as a sergeant or a platoon commander, actually know more than company or battalion commanders. But the biggest issue, the way I saw it, was their inability to understand our doctrine of combined arms. You use supportive fire, you use dedicated guns with artillery to actually open up hard points and stuff like that. And that was, as I saw it, especially in the first days before they actually realized what we were talking about, one of the issues we had. I don't think, and I didn't realize this back then, before the offensive started, when I was actually talking about these combined arms tactics, they did not realize, or they did not understand what I was talking about. They were like, yeah, but we have rifles and we have Bradleys or tanks and shit like that. That's combined arms. Yeah, in a way, but you need to have the entire chain set up before you start. But yeah, as the time progressed, they actually started to realize and started to fix these issues.
And that, I guess, is important to have those learnings transferred up the chain, because if you block that transition of experience and knowledge, you're never going to be able to take those lessons on board.
No. And that's another thing. I understand why this issue is with the Ukrainian army, but many of the officers comes from the university courses you can take to become an officer, and then you don't need to do your military service because you do this, but they're far from enough to actually train effective officers. Some of the people who've done this know that they don't have enough knowledge, so they will listen, and they will listen very carefully. They will ask questions, but some of them, yeah, questions are a bit frowned on in the Ukrainian system. They won't ask because it's not officer-like. And then you have the range up to the ones who actually thinks they're fucking Field Marshal Montgomery themselves. So yeah.
Yeah. Back on the combined arms, how important? Now, obviously, here you've got challenges or gaps in sort of training and strategy, but how important is it in the well, I won't use the word failure of the counteroffensive, but the fact the counteroffensive didn't meet the overhyped ambitions for it? How significant is the lack of air power and perhaps an underestimation of Russia's defensive capabilities? Because, of course, right from the start of the war, everyone's saying, well, the Russians are incapable of anything. Were their ability to create sort of these deep defensive fortifications, minefields, etc., massively underestimated?
I wouldn't say massive. We know that they had really deep and good defensive lines. What we underestimated totally was the amount of mines they put out. I mean, me coming down there, we had drone recon and stuff like that, so we saw, because we came down before the green season started, so we saw the some of the mine lines they put out on top of the ground. We did not see the buried mines. And we had a fairly good estimate where the positions were, but to be honest to you, we expected the Russian soldiers, I think, to be less motivated. Me fighting with the 47th, we ran head straight into some of the best soldiers the Russian army has. We did not have any mobilized troops at all around the Robotin and stuff like that. That was contract soldiers all along. Same thing, they blow up the dam. Yeah, that was a really smart move of them, because that meant the info we got like a week in was that basically all the heavy equipment that was placed on that part of the front that was flooded, they moved and put in front of us. And yeah, I know the first night we had maybe around 30 impacts every minute from artillery, close impacts, and that's below 100 meters all along.
Now, this is very important because I still see what I consider disinformation being put around, that the Kakhovka dam explosion might have been a failure of the structure due to Russians not maintaining it. It might have been an accident, blah blah blah. This sounds far more strategic.
That was not an accident.
No,
that was somebody who really knew what he was doing, and the one who planned the defensive lines down towards Melitopol. Yeah, that guy did his homework, I can tell you that. You had armored killing fields with positions on 3 sides and extensive, really dense minefields in between. And it just kept stretching. You had artillery, you had tanks in hidden positions, anti-tank missiles everywhere. So no, that was a really, really well-planned defensive strategy they had. We might have been able to push through fast and hard if there would have been what I consider a normal amount of mines, but
an air cover wouldn't necessarily have massively improved the situation. Would you have had more protection for mine clearance, etc., with air cover, or is this almost a moot point?
No, I doubt that. In the beginning, that would not have done that much. Yeah, it would have been nice to have the first positions bombed, but on the other hand, the amount of artillery shells hitting was tremendous on both sides. So yeah, I don't think it would have done that much.
And strategically, do you think Russians therefore have really built these defenses along the southern line, either because they thought that's where the main thrust would be towards Crimea, or do they have a very acute understanding that if they lose parts of Donbass, that's not the end of Putin's regime necessarily, but if they lose Crimea, it's symbolically an absolute disaster and the end of Putin.
Yeah. Well, I think Crimea is for them the most important part. Donbass, Luhansk, stuff like that. Yeah, that's money, more or less. They can get money from there, but Crimea, that's a symbol. And I think that both, you take the Crimean War against the English and French, you'll take the Second World War with the Sevastopol battles and stuff like that. I think this is symbolically extremely important for the Russian, how they see themselves. These are some pretty important battles for them. So
I mean, it's a victory if we are going to have a clearly defined sense of what Ukrainian victory looks like. There are many elements of that, but would you say that taking Crimea is high on that target list?
Oh yes, it is. When I came down, I figured that yeah, we might be able to hold the Russians off, inflict enough casualties so they will actually start negotiating. And then maybe, just maybe, Ukraine might subside Crimea and get the rest back, and it will be good with that. But as the war has progressed with massacres and war crimes and shit like that, to be honest to you, I don't think you can get the Ukrainians to negotiate a peace at all. It's all or nothing for them.
And having seen the Russians in action, one of my questions was going to be the sheer brutality, the violation of every code of war and its conduct, not only is being broken incidentally, but it seems systematically and strategically. This is, war crimes are a feature, not a bug of the Russian way of doing war.
I think it's both. If you look historically on the Russian army, this is what they do. Yeah, I understand that they were pissed on the Germans when they started occupying the German homeland after World War II. But look at any war the Russians been in, or where there's been Russian soldiers. They do this shit. This is what they do. And I think that's a combination of uneducated soldiers, which are not led by what I would say competent officers. I'm not going to piss on Russian officers like that, because yeah, they obviously have some competent officers, but for us, it's sergeants or NCOs holding the soldiers back. I mean, 18, 19-year-old kids, they will do dumb shit when they're scared. So you need somebody actually holding them back. That's what our NCOs do. The Russians, no, they don't. You can take Bucha, for example. You had FSB setting up torture chambers and stuff like that, getting people in. But I would guess the majority of the people getting killed on the streets was killed when the Russians pulled out. They just fired at anything they wanted. And yeah, if you have a normal structured army with discipline, you're not going to have those incidents. But if you let kids go when they're scared, yeah, they're going to do dumb shit. That's not an excuse. As a normal human being, you shouldn't be doing that. If you have a normal upbringing, or if your society has certain norms, that's not going to happen. But if you don't have that, yeah, then you're going to have the Russian army.
And a complete, perhaps, unwillingness to intervene or impose, as you say, those standards, because it's perhaps seen as advantageous for this stuff. It's a form of psychological pressure combined with.
And I think this is a very clear example of what you get when you have an army that builds on a really, really strict hierarchy, and where you piss down, and you really piss down on the pyramid. So, yeah.
That's quite an image there, a pyramid of piss. That is the Russian army in a nutshell. Yeah. And you have been involved in training many thousands of Ukrainian troops. What would you say then is that component of the training, both yours and what you've seen in the Ukrainian army, to prevent war crimes being committed, to make sure the Ukrainians keep the upper hand? They've got to defend themselves, of course. And I think I'll ask you in a minute about this, because I feel their hands have been tied in some instances. But how do you try to prevent this kind of dumb stuff happening, as you say, as part of your training program?
Well, it's quite easy. After Bucha, when that came out, I was in Kiev training soldiers in Kiev. And I've never seen soldiers that furious. They wanted to massacre every Russian they saw. So what we did actually was reel them in. As soon as we had guys coming with dumb suggestions, let's do this, let's do that, we just reel them in, have them group up, and then we explain exactly what's going to happen to Ukraine if they do this. What's going to happen when our press gets hold of Ukrainians doing dumb shit and what our politicians is going to do when that comes up. And they have a very clear understanding of what the Western aid means to Ukraine. They know that they can't win this war without that help. So telling them that, yeah, you do that, fine. First of all, you're going to have to live with it. Second of all, when our press gets a hold of that, they're going to start an article that will have our politicians shit their pants, and then you won't get a bullet.
And Russian propaganda, Russian disinfo is built around trying to provoke things that it can then weaponize. It doesn't matter if Russia is doing the same or worse, they can latch onto it and weaponize the propaganda.
Yeah. So, yeah, they already know this. So you just need to remind them. And what I see as the important part is actually doing this, telling them this, so they do remember it. So it doesn't get a foothold in the units that, yeah, we're going to do this. We're going to get payback. No, you're not. You'll take your prisoners of war, you bring them back, you'll have the justice system check them through. If they are war criminals, yeah, then they'll get convicted in a court, not by you on the field. That's the important issue to actually push on them all the time.
That's a very powerful message, yeah.
Yeah. As far I've heard about dumb shit being done. I never seen it. On the other hand, the fighting is extremely brutal. We normally don't take that many prisoners. First of all, the Russians are scared. They think they're going to be murdered by us, so they don't normally give up that easily. Look at the interviews with the prisoners that we actually do take. They get phone calls, they can call their parents, they can call their wives, and they get put in a camp where they do fairly simple and easy labor. Basically the same that our prisoners back home do in prisons here. And yeah, they get fed, they get clothing. So normally there's not that much of a complaint from the Russian prisoners of war. I've heard prisoners who actually don't want to go back home. They rather stay in the Ukrainian system until this war is over because they don't have to fight and they get fed.
If they know their history as well, anyone who's been a prisoner of war and then goes back, if this is Stalinist times, they'd all be sent to camps or worse, killed on the spot. Now, I don't know if Putin's Russia is going to quite go to that extent, but if any of them are smart and really understand their own system, they're going to know that they don't really probably have a place in either the Russian army or it could be far, far worse for them if they go back and start expressing anything that discredits the political system and the army.
Oh yeah. Well, I've actually heard or saw an interview the other day with a Russian soldier. When he contacted his wife, she had been told that he was wanted as a defector. So his army unit put him up not as a prisoner of war or a KIA, but as a defector. And that means, yeah, he can't go back to Russia. He was terrified to be put in a prison exchange program because he knew that, yeah, me coming back, that's going to be an issue.
That's 7 to 10 years in penal servitude, and then a label for life. Robotynia sounds like an absolutely horrific experience. Was that the most intense fighting, and was that where you were wounded? I mean, I do have to ask about your experience and your rehabilitation, because I think it's a very important aspect, I think, of this, that so many Ukrainians do get medical attention, appropriate medical attention, which is perhaps denied to soldiers on the other side. But what was your experience?
Well, I got injured on the way into Robotyne, about 1.5 kilometers outside before we reached the village itself. We were actually trying to take positions to get into the last frontal protection of Robotyne when I got injured. And yeah, I must say my experience of the Ukrainian healthcare is excellent. I'd say I got just as good of a treatment in Ukraine that I would have gotten back home in the first period. They did, yeah, basically everything right. They had me sedated for the first couple of days, getting shrapnels and shit like that out of me, putting up like a construction thing on my arm because the bone was broken in the arm. And then coming up to Dnipro and later Kiev, yeah, even though I don't speak Ukrainian that much, and most of the doctors seeing that I am in the army, not in the Foreign Legion, I get put in different hospitals than the Legionnaires does, and they don't speak English, period. But Google Translate works, and the treatment is great. So the only thing I can say about my experience of the Ukrainian medical system is that it's great. I'm really pleased.
This is a fascinating angle. I'm going to dig a bit deeper because I've been listening to a lot of material that has come from the Russian journalists who are abroad. And one of the stories they've been digging into is apparently the conditions for, not that many Russian soldiers potentially make it out alive, but actually the scale of the number of people who are wounded means that there are potentially tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Russians who are flooding the Russian healthcare system. And if anyone has lived in Russia, you know that the provision of care is not necessarily equal. Often you will need to have contacts. Often you will need to be able to pay money to get the right kind of care. Corruption is a huge problem, and if you don't have money, then it's a real lottery. The scenes they describe sounds almost like, 18th century Crimea. So it's horrific circumstances of way more bodies than there are physical sort of beds or care and attention. Now, one of the Russian propaganda angles, of course, is that Ukraine is deeply corrupt, and somehow that justifies the invasion. Do you think the quality of care you're describing here really counters that propaganda argument? Because you cannot have a deeply corrupt and broken system that nonetheless offers the kind of care you've described.
No, I don't think so. And sure, I got offers from friends in Ukraine to actually put me into the more private medical care, but I did not see that being necessary. The guy I talked about before in Lviv, he actually offered to pay for me getting swapped to another hospital, stuff like that, in Kiev to, a high-end private. And no, because the hospitals I were in, I know I got moved to Kiev really fast, but that's because they do not want foreign soldiers in the frontline hospitals. They want them out of there fast because in Kiev, it's easier to have them protected. And yeah, I do understand that. But I've also seen the medical chain from the front lines and back, and they have a really good triage system. If you're not badly wounded, you'll stay at the rear medical station at the front and get your treatment there. If you are badly wounded, like me, I wasn't that far from dying. They actually bypassed the first medical stations and got me directly into the hospital. And that's not because I'm a foreigner, because the people in the ambulance picking me up did not have a clue about that. But they knew I was really badly wounded. So they got me into the care I needed as fast as possible. The other guys ended up at these triage stations and stuff like that, but they still got into medical treatment fairly fast.
And what is the dependence there? I mean, out of this infrastructure that's been created, how much of it depends on the so-called civil society, on volunteers, on non-state actors to create this network, and how involved is the state in this frontline medical support, military medical support?
Well, the entire army are dependent on foreign help, and that's easy. They had a 200,000 army before the war. Now they have an army of over 1 million. That means the Ukrainian state, they can't really handle that without help. I mean, no army, you can take England, Sweden, or what you want, we can't handle that either. So the volunteer support is essential, and it has been. The Ukrainians are catching up slowly, but they are still dependent on the volunteer support and the volunteer help. Yeah. So they still need the continuous support. A lot of our medical equipment that we had were donations from both states and private operators. So yeah, it is essential.
And the quality of some of those donations has been questioned, but as the war has gone on, have you seen sort of quality thresholds and criteria being imposed? So even though you might get a lot of stuff coming in, you wouldn't necessarily get everything to the front because it may not be like, for instance, tourniquets. You don't want substandard medical gear ending up where it could put people's lives at risk. So have you seen a gradual sort of improvement in imposing these quality standards?
Oh yes, and the Ukrainians have done a great work there. In the beginning, we saw a lot of Chinese tourniquets that breaks when you put pressure on them and shit like that. The Ukrainian state or authorities really quickly picked up on that and started refusing that shit, or using it as training materials and stuff like that. And that's really good. They set up some really, but it's really private initiatives to actually manufacture really good tourniquets in country. They don't have the abilities to do the big volumes, but they do some really good stuff.
I've heard as well that on the corruption side, you have a fairly unique zero tolerance approach to corruption, bureaucracy, inertia. What's been your experience of that? How much of I would say, a sort of a drag effect does that have on Ukrainian success? And how have you been able to cut through and deal with these sort of hangovers of, let's say, the Russified Soviet system?
Yeah, I've seen some of it, and it was worse last year. On the other hand, the Ukrainians have actually dealt with it or started to deal with it, especially on the lower levels, and the people on their own don't really accept it as much anymore. Another thing I think we should take in account is that the Ukrainian way of looking at corruption is not our way of looking at corruptions. It's more hands-on, money exchanging hands, stuff like that. It's not as much as for us, yeah, me doing you a favor and then you doing me a favor is also type of corruption. They don't really see it that way in many cases. So the same as with the so-called Nazi organizations. I think we need to look at that with another set of eyes. And the same goes for the corruption. And they have really started to push down hard on the corruption. They changed laws. They set up a lot harsher penalties for corruption, and especially if the corruption is aimed at the army. They actually have some really harsh punishments. I think that if you steal or embezzle army money, the sentences start at 7 years in prison now. And yeah, that's going to sting.
And similarly, they've been introducing, I believe, electronic sort of transparency procedures that track equipment, especially heavy equipment and munitions, from delivery through to the front line and potentially when they're used, destroyed, etc. So have you seen again a sort of sophistication increasing of how the transport, delivery, and tracking of various equipment as well as its usage has gone through? Because of course for Western governments, that's a big Russian propaganda talking point, is weapons ending up somewhere else being sold off. There's very little evidence that's happening, but what systems are put in place to make sure that doesn't happen?
They have, like you said, the electronic systems, but I've been contacted by the security police, and they asked me and other foreigners for help actually checking up foreigners that they suspect doing things like this. They are extremely careful about where and how they use things. There was a story going around last year about when the first French CSAR systems got in, the Russians got their hands on one of those, and that was rumored to have been some sort of sales thing. And that, as far as I know, that guy basically went to jail without passing go. No, they are extremely careful and extremely scared for weapons to end up outside of Ukraine. But at the same time, it's a battle, it's a war. You can't have 100% accountability for everything. So if something disappears, because you have criminal gangs and stuff like that will roam a battlefield trying to get their hands on shit, and especially above a place like Kiev, where you had really hard fighting in an urban environment. You're gonna have people moving around, and if they get their hands on something, that could end up on the wrong place.
And this isn't just a factor of it being in Eastern Europe. This is, I'm sure, this sort of stuff happened at a tremendous scale in World War One, World War Two. This is just a feature, I guess, of a conflict of this scale.
Oh yeah, but if you take World War II, for example, the amount of guns that the Allies dropped to resistant groups, a lot of those guns are still laying around in Europe, in basements, on attics, stuff like that. So weapons are going to float around. I think the Ukrainians are doing this fairly good. Everybody remembers the truckloads of rifles that they distributed in Kiev last year, and you still don't have shootings with military weapons in town. I mean, me as a sergeant, I can't even go with a gun in uniform in Kiev without the police asking for my papers and why I'm having a gun. So they are really, really strict. Same thing. They were selling civilian weapons at that period and giving licenses out for those weapons without really doing all the checks that Ukrainian law requires. As soon as that calmed down, the police went back and started to going through all of these. And actually, if you did not check all the dots, they'll come and get your gun. And they did that a lot.
That's incredibly systematic. Now, I know that your impact, you've trained many thousands. You've clearly commanded the respect of the Ukrainian forces that you've worked with. I believe that is certainly sort of recognized. How important is it for Ukraine that it's just not them in this fight? That not just that they're getting support from Western governments, but that individual people from the West are there, with their backs to the wall, helping Ukraine, and have a degree of understanding about the Ukrainian, the dilemma they're in and why they're fighting for their survival. How important is that, both practically speaking, but also in morale terms?
I think that's very important. The army part is easy. They see that they're not alone. They see that we help them. They see that we utilize our bigger knowledge to do as much as we possibly can. And I know the guys, when I came down to the front, they were really surprised that, first of all, I was one of the first who came down, and that I was willing to actually go with them to do dangerous shit. I had the option to actually sit in a headquarters doing nothing. That's not the way I do things. I promised them in training that I would do what I could for them at the front, and I think I showed them that I did that. So yeah, I get respect from that, of course. But what's even more fantastic, to be honest to you, when I was in hospital, the amount of civilian and private Ukrainians willing to come into hospitals. When the word got out in Kiev that I was actually laying at a normal hospital and not the Legion hospital, where they don't really have this much, I had a steady stream of visitors coming in asking what I needed, if I needed anything, if I wanted anything. It was not, if I wanted to, I could have been laying on my back in that hospital bed and just eating grapes and drinking sodas, and people would bring me anything. I don't think that would have been a good way of doing shit. I'm not there to get my own pleasures fulfilled. So no, but when I came into the hospital, I had nothing. They cut everything off me at the first hospital. So basically all I had was a pair of underwear. Going out from there, and I said no, or tried to say no to things, I had more than I could carry. So basically just spread it out among the other soldiers in the hospital, the Ukrainians, so they got as much as possible as well. And then, yeah, getting into a hospital bed with 4 or 6 complete strangers. They got some food from their families, so their families came up with food or something. No issues. It's like, come here, come eat. Eat. One of my colleagues was injured before me, and she had a broken bone. She came up with food for me and for the other guys, coming in with boxes or bags of food on her crutches, stuff like that. It's no, the people in Ukraine are extremely hospitable and friendly and grateful for all the help we give them. Same thing in training, being out in small villages, farm villages, living in houses. People come with food, people come with anything, and they will not accept anything in return. Being in the army, yeah, we were supplied, we had food, stuff like that. We had to cook it on our own, boohoo. But same thing, we ended up with having an excess of food that was quite large, trying to give that to the people in the villages, and they just refuse. You're soldiers, you need this. If you go along the roads in Ukraine, you'll see stacks of food, canned food along the roads. That's for the army. The army have cars going by picking this shit up and stuff like that. So yeah, it's a fantastic country.
That's incredible. I mean, it's very moving. It also highlights why Ukrainians are fighting and why it's worth us supporting them, not just to survive, but to triumph in this and to prevail over Russia. So really my last question here is, it seems clear now that we've been approaching Russia with the wrong mindset. We have fallen prey to their terroristic nuclear threats. We have not given Ukraine, even though a lot has been given, it is not enough to ensure victory. And actually, the provision of equipment has not been aligned with a clear concept of what victory means. In your mind, what needs to change and what do we need to do about it to ensure a clean Ukrainian victory?
Well, to be honest to you, I think we should open the floodgates completely. I understand our government's unwillingness to give the most modern or the newest of our weapon systems, but we have a shitload of a bit older equipment that is not as classified and stuff like that anymore. Send it. Get our ammo factories working on 3 shifts. Supply them with the ammunition and the grenades they need. I mean, they are fighting for us. I don't think anybody's dumb enough to think that if we let Russia win this war, it's going to stop here. It's going to end here. It's not going to. He's going to go on the next and the next and the next. And I mean, look at the demands he did a couple of years ago. No NATO expansion. I'm deciding if these countries can do this or do that. That's not how the world works. I mean, he's actually been talking about invading the Baltics and Finland and stuff like that because they're old Russian colonies, blah, 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 or Soviet. Come on, this guy needs to go. He's just as mad as Hitler was. I don't really see a difference between them two. It might be hard for some people. Yeah, Hitler was in the middle of Europe. He fucked around with countries that is very familiar to us. This guy is doing the same, but he's a bit off to the east, and we don't really know as much about Ukraine, Georgia, stuff like that, but it's still European countries. So yeah, we can't have that kind of megalomanias on our doorstep.
And of course, there's a lot of countries that come within this potential threat. It's the European ones you've mentioned, but also there's Moldova that's not yet part of NATO, but there's Central Asia as well. Kazakhstan and all those other countries are in the firing line.
Yeah, they are. And I mean, he's been messing around for a long time, not only with Ukraine and Georgia. Moldova, as you said, is taking like 1/4 of that country as well. So he has Russian troops there. That's an issue for us all the time, having to have troops on that border. Yeah, of course, Russia doesn't have that many soldiers in Transnistria, but they are still a threat to some pretty large Ukrainian cities, and especially Odessa.
And from what we can gather, the original plan was to take the entire southern coastline and hook up. My last question here, do you think Putin's ambitions have changed at all, or is he still really intent on tearing Ukraine to bits and dominating it?
No, I don't think it's changed at all. Just look at the rhetorics they use. Like, these are Russians, this is the part of Russia, Ukraine has never been a country, blah, 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 blah. It's he's I don't think he's gonna give up. I had a hope for this war to end like that's more or less like the second Chechen war, with the Russian mothers saying no and stop. But no, he suppressed every opportunity for that. Basically, I think either Putin dies or Ukraine fucks up the Russian army so much so the Russian generals actually do a military coup.
So this is the time for the gloves to come off, in your view. The West really needs to take this seriously and arm
up, give them as much as they need. I understand that there is a fear for giving them too powerful weapons so they can start striking long inside Russia. On the other hand, the Ukrainians are extremely careful with doing that in a way that doesn't really upset Russia that much. I don't think we're going to see, even if we give them Gripens or F-16s and stuff like that, we're not going to see bomb runs into Russia. We're going to see these planes being utilized as fighters, protecting the fronts, and we're going to see them do attack runs on the front lines or just behind. But I don't think Ukraine's going to start doing bomber stories into Russia and stuff like that.
That's a very powerful message to convey, and of course to make Crimea untenable, which is one of the key strategies behind that. Well, I wish you luck with what you're doing. What you're doing seems to be fantastically important, both for Ukraine and, of course, the individual troops who you have contact with. What you've done already is of tremendous importance and courage. Christopher, thank you so much for sharing your time, experience, and insights with us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
That's been a huge pleasure, and yeah, very much look forward to potentially speaking in future and potentially even meeting up.
Yeah, that would be nice.